The question arises, what is conservatism? And I like to discuss the ideas, at least, behind conservatism by going to particular individuals as representatives of the position. And I think there are two great figures in the history of conservatism stretching right to the present time. They were contemporaries, they were associates, and they were influential. Those two men were Edmund Burke and Adam Smith. Burke, as I've already mentioned before, was a defender of the rights of Englishmen. He believed in constitutional rights, though of course not in the sense of a written constitution, because Britain didn't have one, but in terms of traditional law and liberties associated with the common law. Burke was a defender. And he believed that it was an error to use centralized political power to remove those rights and English liberties, which had been characteristic of the country, he believed, for hundreds of years. So he was a conservative in the sense of defending traditional law, traditional social institutions such as the family and the church. He was an opponent of centralized state power, which he distrusted totally. And as such, he would have said that the centralization of power in the context of the British Constitution was a revolt against tradition and some kind of either revolutionary or rationalist attempt to take away the traditional liberties of individual citizens. The other great figure was Adam Smith. And in 1776, his great work was published, An Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations. We know it as The Wealth of Nations. Smith did not believe that the central government could act as a central planning agency for the economy as a whole. He believed in free trade, that is, the right of individuals one-on-one to make exchanges with each other. And he extended that principle to the borders of the nation. He did not think that you should make decisions as a nation to interfere with trade in order to build up the supply of gold in the government's treasury. He believed in what he called a system of natural liberty. And he believed that if individuals were left alone to truck and barter, in the famous phrase, to trade with one another, to seek their own individual self-interest by their own productivity, without coercion and without an appeal to government, that would lead to an expansion of the wealth of nations. In other words, he defended the whole idea of the wealth of a nation in terms of the pursuit of wealth and the pursuit of individual self-interest in a free market social order. He believed in individual liberty, and he did not believe in centralized political power, and certainly not the system that we know of as the old British Empire, the granting of monopolies, the granting of certain kinds of trade routes on the sea. He was an opponent of what we call the British Empire in the sense of the old empire of trade. Well, at that time, so were the American colonists. They were opponents of it too. They didn't approve of the centralization. So Thomas Jefferson reads The Wealth of Nations almost as soon as it's published and adopts the basic ideas of that book. He, that is to say, Smith and Burke, were friends. They respected each other, they corresponded with each other. Now, Burke was no economist. Of course, there was no one called an economist in those days. There were moral philosophers. And economics in the hands of Adam Smith became an extension of moral philosophy. And Burke was not a systematizer in the same way that Smith was. Smith was building this great overarching system of logic, defending the concept of free trade. Well, that was not how Burke thought, but he liked the conclusions. He thought that the conclusions were consistent with his view of English liberty and his view of the danger of centralized political power. So Burke and Smith got along very well. They had great respect for each other. On the one hand, you have a Scottish rationalist building a rationalistic system, 800-page system, to defend the idea that a nation gets rich by the freedom of individual citizens, with this other individual who was British certainly by citizenship, who had been born in Ireland, who was a member of Parliament, and who had been a defender of the American cause up at least to the point of the Revolution. Now, Smith was no revolutionary, and Burke was no revolutionary, but he did believe in the rights of individual English citizens. So here they were together in the period of the Revolution and the period after, committed to a system of personal liberty. Smith on the basis of rational thought, the extension of thought, rational thought to the general society. Burke on the basis of traditional English liberties, both coming to the same idea of personal freedom and a decentralized social order. Over the next century, Adam Smith becomes associated with what we call classical liberalism, the idea of personal self-government limited by law and with no central economic planning at the national level. Burke wouldn't say that was wrong, but he was associated not with a system of economics, not with a grand scheme of logic defending individual liberty. He, in fact, was opposed to that kind of an attempt to build any kind of a political universe based on some kind of central planning, central manifesto, central goal for all mankind. He opposed that idea. He was a British citizen. He favored the rights of British citizens, the rights of Englishmen. Now, the American tradition certainly tended to be constitutionalist, based on law, based on common law, a bunch of lawyers, colonial lawyers. They were not generally centralists. They believed in what both Smith and Burke would say would be limited self-government under the rule of law. The Constitution was ratified in 1787, 1789. Within months, you began to see the disruption coming to France. The French had been bankrupted by the War of Independence. First, the 7 Years' War, never completely recovered from that, and then came its support of the American Revolution. Now remember, the French were not just fighting in North America. This was a world war. They were fighting Britain on the high seas. Wherever they could fight, they fought. And this battle went even into the Far East, the area around India, where they were establishing, both sides attempting to establish empires, trading empires. So this was a world war. This was a big deal, and it was an expensive deal, and the French king ran out of money. And so he had to go back to an old institution called the Estates General in order to get permission to restructure the tax system. And it had not been called to make a decision on taxes in well over a century. Not since the early 17th century had it been called out to make a decision. But he had to do it legally to get taxes increased, and so he called it. Well, then the political fight began. Who was going to serve? Who was going to be represented? Who, on what basis would they be represented? What would be their ideas that they promised to go and fight for in Paris when assembled in 1789? And lawyers and merchants were prominent. And these men went, and within a very brief period of time, having arrived in Paris, there arose a real battle for political control inside the country. And the sovereignty of the king versus the sovereignty of this recently called legislative assembly broke out. Then it was a question of who would rule in the assembly, and the political battles began. And the great phrase that came out of the battle over the control of the government by the assembly was the rights of man. And a document was issued with that phrase, a rationalistic rights of man. Burke immediately recognizes this as misguided. He favors rights of Englishmen. If they had said the rights of particular provinces in France, fine. The rights of those who lived in Breton, the rights of some other area of France where they didn't even speak French, because most people outside of the central area around Paris did not speak exclusively French. Some spoke it not at all. But the assembly was not in favor of the rights of particular groups or particular regions. The assembly was promoting the rights of man. And that just set off a red light, if they'd had red lights in those days, certainly a red cape in front of a bull for Burke. He sees this instantly as leading to revolution. So he's skeptical throughout 1789. By early 1790, where the assembly is attempting to rewrite the Constitution, make a written Constitution, he breaks. He's determined to stop it, and he begins writing a manuscript. It's published towards the end of 1790. It becomes the key document in the history of conservatism. It's called Reflections on the Revolution in France. And he warned against the centralization of power. He warned against this great battle to fight for the rights of men instead of the rights of regions or groups. He said it would lead to a vast expansion of power. It would lead to violence. As a predicting document, there's almost nothing quite like it in history. He predicted not the total extent, but the general tendency of what took place in France between 1790 and 1794 in what we call the Reign of Terror, Robespierre's reign. He sketched it out. And in doing so, he broke with his friends, who were much more partial to the French, much more partial to the rights of man, radicals personally, radicals in terms of political philosophy. They regarded Burke as a man who had betrayed them. But Burke had not betrayed them because he had never believed in that kind of defense of personal liberty. He didn't like grand systems. He opposed grand systems. He didn't trust grand systems. That's why he did not trust the French revolutionaries, because he saw them as promoting a grand system, and he thought it would lead to tyranny, and it did. Now by 1793, when France goes to war with Great Britain, then his old friends either have to change their minds or shut up, because in the midst of the war, you're not about to go publicly and say that you think the French really have a great idea there. And so by 1793 and onward, Burke's idea is vindicated and accepted. Now that war tears up Europe until 1815, and when it's all over, it's not a republic, it's an empire, and Napoleon is in charge of it, and he tears Europe apart, always in the name of the grand logic of the French Revolution, always in the name of the rights of man. He becomes exactly what Burke had said would happen, that it would wind up in some form of military dictatorship. And Europe is torn apart and is never put back together. The ideas get out, the ideas of revolution, of the rights of man, these ideas get into all of Western Europe. And so, as a result, Burke and Burke's ideas become the focal point of the anti-revolutionists for the rest of the century. And in Europe, when you find groups that were opposed to the idea of the French Revolution, they were Burkeans. They were defenders of traditional liberties, localism against the great nation state. They were defenders of the idea that you could not trust politics to reshape mankind. You could not trust the planners, the devisers of grand schemes. Burke was the classic man opposed to grand schemes, and his followers were the same. And so you have the escalation in European life, the escalation of battles with classical liberals who believe in free trade, the rise of the socialist movement that believes in centralized power, revolutionary violent groups, including anarchist groups, all trying to overthrow the king and overthrow the church and overthrow the priesthoods, and the conservatives saying we've got to maintain the peace, you can't have a perfect society, don't try to overthrow the social order. And Europe essentially goes into a period of revolutionary violence that really doesn't get settled until the end of the 20th century, till the fall of the Soviet Union. So here you have Burke as the non-ideological defender of the idea of traditional liberties and local power, local authority, where he's perceived as a conservative in Europe, and correctly so, that's what he is. But in the United States, he's perceived as a man who favored the American defense, the ideological defense of the Revolution, the rights of Englishmen. He's perceived as a man in favor of free markets, which he was. And so Adam Smith and Burke become essentially united in people's thinking to the extent that they read Smith and Burke. And most people don't read books that big. Smith's wasn't that big, but you still have to be intelligent and thoughtful to read it. But ideas trickle down. And so in the United States, you have Burke and Smith as decentralized defenders of a social order based on voluntary contract and the rule of law. So who's the enemy to that position in the United States? It's the centralizers. It's the Hamiltonians. And the division between Hamilton and Madison, which you can find if you look for it in the Federalist Papers, the division that certainly becomes an open political warfare under the period of John Adams, when he hands down the Alien and Sedition laws, and Jefferson and Madison oppose it in print. The decentralized states' rights position that Jefferson is in favor of, and Madison officially is in favor of, is challenged by Hamilton and the old Federalist Party. They want more central power. They want a nation united in debt, where people with money are committed to the federal government because they buy the government's bonds. Big defender of debt. He becomes the great promoter of the first bank of the United States. Of course, it wasn't called the first bank. It was the Bank of the United States, privately owned, with federal sanctions to be the money manipulator of the whole country, this privately owned organization. Hamilton is the great pusher of this, and Jefferson is the great opponent of it. And so you have the division of the country politically through the first decade between the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Democrats. And then when Jefferson comes into power and the Federalists very rapidly, almost overnight, fade from power permanently, you have the tradition that is very much Hamiltonian in those political factions that want government to build roads. Later on, 2 decades later, they want the government to build canals. You have this whole tradition of let government do more, let the national government do more. And officially, at least, Jefferson is opposed to it. Now, when the Louisiana Purchase opportunity comes along, yeah, he kind of hides the old opposition to centralized power, and he kind of ignores it, because here he indebts the country for $15 million. But he doubles the size of the country in one shot, including getting what everybody really did want, the New Orleans port. And he at least it looks as though he's going to get it and keep it if the British don't get it back, which they might have done in 1815, except Andy Jackson beat him. But Jefferson expands, doubles the size of the country, but he does so on the basis that individual farmers, individual families can move west, get involved in farming, get involved in owning property as families. So it's all justified in the rhetoric of individual family liberty, even though it's a tremendous centralization of authority that he's able to do this. But he does it, and he says, let's see if Congress fights it, and Congress looks at all that free land and says, done deal, and so the country is doubled in size in one shot in 1803. Now the tradition of this battle between the centralized power of the federal government and the Jeffersonian position of states' rights and limited government at the centralized level, limited federal power, that battle continues right up until the 1860s. And then war breaks out. And so you have the South seceding as a unit, state by state, but seceding as certainly as a confederacy. It's revolution, says the North. No, says the South, it's not revolution, it's a defense of constitutional liberty, guaranteed in the Constitution. So it's kind of a replay of what took place between the British and the colonists in the 1770s. Each one appealing to a particular legal order. One group saying you violated the order by centralizing power. You're attacking property rights, which was the American position during the American Revolution. And so they say, we're pulling out. We're not going to be part of this. You're violating constitutional liberties. That was the legal position. Now in the North, certainly the abolitionists, which were a minority group, certainly, they said, well, the South is right. The Constitution was a mistake. It's a covenant with death. We've got to use political power to make certain that slavery does not spread. That was Lincoln's position, of course. And then the real abolitionists said, no, we've got to stamp out slavery altogether. And it's got to be done by law. We've got to box in the Southerners so they don't get any more states, so that they will not control the House of Representatives, and we'll be able to outvote them in the Senate. And we just have to make certain that we don't have any more states coming in that are slave states. And the South looks at the map and says, we're going to get boxed in, we're going to lose our position. We're going to lose the right to hold slaves, which was the central economic institution of the South. And so the idea of states' rights as a judicial position gets associated with a defense of slavery. And the South is willing to admit to that connection up until 1865. And then they drop it. Then it goes down what Orwell would have called the memory hole. And the defense of the South becomes exclusively legal and judicial after the war. But prior to the war, it was a legal issue and a judicial issue, but the central battle was over slavery. If there had not been a slave system, you would not have had the Civil War. And the North didn't go in it for that reason initially, but Lincoln pushed them in that direction after 1863. Certainly, the abolitionists did know what they were doing, the hardcore ones. They made the presentation as a moral issue. Some of them within the conservative churches, the Presbyterians, for example, the Methodists, the Congregational, of course, they were not centralized, but they certainly were powerful in the North. They said it's a religious issue. This is a matter of Christianity. It's the issue of kidnapping. And in the South, the same Presbyterian associated pastors, the same pastors groups associated with the Methodists, they're saying, no, no, it's a right of property. You find slavery in the Bible. There shouldn't be an attempt by the central government to take away a right of property, especially one that finds its defense in the Constitution itself. And so the battle is in part legal and constitutional, and that certainly is, you'd call it, I think, Burkean. And the battle is in terms of private property and the defense of private property rights. So you'd say, well, that must be Adam Smith. And Jefferson certainly was in favor of Smith. And Southerners generally were in favor of classical liberalism among the scholars, at least a lot of them were. The leadership was. So then what's the issue? If it's not a battle over Burke and it's not a battle over Smith, what is it a battle over? And it is a battle over the right of the federal government to have the final say in what constitutes the law. That's the issue. It is pro-centralization with respect to the final court of appeal. That is the Supreme Court or the federal government acting together as a unit. And that is clear in 1787, but only to the anti-federalists who say this is where it's going. It's going to be a federal system of judicial interpretation. They're going to centralize economics. They're going to centralize the final say in the legal system. If you get into this system, it's going to turn it into a centralized empire. It's going to go Roman Republic to Roman Empire. Don't support it. Well, they were not well organized. Madison beat them. The Constitution was ratified. And so in 1860, the same kind of issues that were raised in 1787 by the Anti-Federalists then get raised again by the South. And it's the issue of judicial supremacy. Who has the final say in how the law is going to be interpreted? So in that sense, you would say, well, it seems conservative, but ultimately, the more you move towards centralization, the more you get into the wing of conservatism associated with Hamilton and the centralizing power. And as we'll see as we go on, that same debate divides the conservative movement today. That same battle between the issue of the final court of appeal, that final institutional decision that says we have the right to lay down the law and to enforce the law, that issue is still part of the battle within the conservative movement in much the same way that it was a central battle ideologically and in terms really organizationally and politically in, say, 1850. Who has the right of final appeal? And the Hamiltonians want the central government to have it and to have much more power in terms of directing the economy. And the Jeffersonians want to have a decentralized system, much more autonomy at the local level. They want a states' rights system. They don't want this centralization of power. And so this great debate leads to the Civil War, and even the two factions can't decide what it's going to be called: war between the states, war of Southern secession, war of Northern aggression. Can't even agree on what it was. Even today, the battle still goes on in terms of the defense of the two positions. The the next section, I'm going to take us into the late 19th century to show how the whole issue moved from morality to science.